Hey everyone. For this episode, we read NBA Jam by Reyan. I hope I pronounced your first name right. I'm not really too sure about that though. Anyway, this is a really great book, especially if you love NBA Jam like I do. And if you don't love NBA Jam, you can still have a lot of fun with this book just because it tells a really interesting story. And it follows really the path of two companies, a large group of developers, and also gives you a little bit of history about where they came from and just why NBA Jam is important to both basketball fans and video game fans. Now, like I said, it follows two companies, which are Midway and Acclaim. Midway made the game, and Acclaim was responsible for porting it. And when the two companies split, as the book explains, Acclaim somehow got the license for NBA Jam, which doesn't make any real sense to me, but I'm not a lawyer, and that's why we have lawyers, so they can make sense of this stuff. Anyway, it's a really amazing story. And to go along with all of that, you also have Electronic Arts' story because they sort of became the evil empire that they are, but back in the 90s they actually gave a crap and they were really one of the pioneers for making simulation games, especially with sports. And they made a few other games and took a lot of chances, but mostly their sports games were what they were known for. The book also goes into the culture of the times, so back in the mid 90s and into the early 90s as well, you had a lot of things going on. So the arcades were not dead, but they were kind of in their last throes. Games like Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat, and NBA Jam kind of helped give it a little bit of a revival, as well as some other games out there like the Turtles arcade games and a few of the other beat 'em ups. Those were really the ones that tried to keep the arcades going as long as they did, and they worked pretty well for what I can remember. I really wasn't much of an arcade player back then, but the few that I went to, you always saw at least a Mortal Kombat and a Street Fighter cabinet. I never saw the NBA Jam cabinet, but I think I would have enjoyed playing the game on arcades as much as I played on home console. So the book starts out with a brief history of the arcades, and really talks about some of the games that Midway had ported over, most likely because they want to tell a lot of the story about Midway, which makes a lot of sense. Especially some of the developers that worked on games like Joust, Defender, as well as the games that they actually brought over to Midway, which were Pac-Man and Space Invaders. These are really important games for Midway to have brought over because it kind of gets their foot in the door and really sort of sets up the way that they wanted to do things, especially with video games. And after they go through a lot of their different mergers, especially with Bally and then later with Williams, you can see how they brought in more IPs and they brought in more developers that would allow them to do different things. Everybody brought their own different experiences to the market in order to make some of the best games possible. As Ryan explains in the book, Midway went through a lot of mergers at the time, especially since they were coming off of the pinball industry, where Bally, Midway, and also Williams were all separate companies, and then later all merged with each other, which is really kind of cool. So you have this thing going on where they know a lot about the pinball industry, and they take a lot of what they learned and tie that into video games. So after those chapters on the histories of arcades and kind of how they expanded over time and sort of changed with the times to some extent, we get more on Mark Trammell. He was the person who designed the game. He also designed a few others while he was at Midway, but NBA Jam, at least for me, is the most memorable one out of the list that he's sort of credited with. He kind of gets his start in a really awesome way, where he starts developing games when he's still in high school in, I believe, the late 70s. And it's just such an awesome story. I'm really glad that it's in here. He really is the developer that we spend the most time talking about out of that original team of developers. It's really a really cool story, and it could honestly be the subject of its own book, but let's just focus more on NBA Jam for the moment. What we also get is the history of basketball games, where they start out as just a simple one-on-one game with kind of graphics that make it look like you're playing basketball, but it's Atari, so maybe not really from what you can see. Also, that game was one player only, it was two player only, so that was really not all that interesting. And then it kind of moved on to be more of like a licensed product. You'll have like Bird versus Magic, and then Jordan versus Bird, and then they go into sort of the unlicensed simulations of basketball with Double Dribble and Great Sports Basketball, because who can forget playing that wonderful game on the Master System? And then it moves on to EA, where they actually got the NBA license, so you had real players and real teams. And I think that's really important that they got both the NBA license and the NBA Players Association license. And even from there, they moved from kind of your basic simulation, where you could really just do like the playoffs, to more of a team mode where you could play a whole season, and eventually onto franchise and player mode. So we then get into kind of the technology for video games at the time, and how that technology sort of moved us towards NBA Jam. Because at the time at Midway, they were focusing on kind of over-the-top games and also working a lot with digitizing sprites. It's a little bit different from like rotoscoping that you'll see in Prince of Persia, where rotoscoping you're literally like animating those motions. With the digitizing, they were taking pictures of an actual actor, and they were just kind of digitizing those pictures and putting them in the game. Mortal Kombat is the best known for it. It was done on Pit Fighter before that, but right now in the book they just focus on Mortal Kombat, and you see how that game, and also another game that Trammell developed, which was Smash TV, that was a very over-the-top arcade game, how those two really moved towards where NBA Jam would be. And they also get into a few other things that I'll talk about in a second. Smash TV was really the game that Trammell made before he went into NBA Jam. He did have kind of a failure with the sequel to Smash TV, but I really wouldn't call it that because he still learned stuff from it. Mortal Kombat kind of gave them the idea to digitize the sprites for their different games, especially going into NBA Jam. And you can tell where Trammell took a lot from both of these games, in that he made it a very, very like over-the-top basketball game, and they also did digitize a lot of the sprites for the NBA players. As the book explains, Midway would eventually move away from making arcade games, but that wasn't until much later. They did split with Acclaim around the late 90s, mostly because they saw the money that Acclaim was making off their home ports, and they figured, heck, we can make that money by ourselves, we don't necessarily need them. NBA Jam was one of those games that really showed Midway, hey, you don't actually need them. You could do this yourself, and for the most part, they were pretty successful for a while at it. So, from reading this entire book, it really kind of made me feel bad for Tim Kitzrow. He's the voice of NBA Jam. He's the one known for making all those really awesome one-liners that come out, like the "he's heating up, he's on fire," and "boom shakalaka." And he never really seemed to get the payment that he kind of deserved. And there's a nice story in here where he had to argue for more money from Acclaim when Acclaim was doing its home ports. And Acclaim didn't want to pay him for some reason. I can't really think of NBA Jam without Kitzrow's voice in it. It just wouldn't make any sense to me whatsoever. So even though I really, really did feel bad for Tim Kitzrow, the story of NBA Jam doesn't really end there. As Ryan explains, they had a few more games afterwards, and after the split from Midway and Acclaim, Acclaim went on to make a bunch of others that were not really well received. Midway did make a few kind of in the spirit of it,
but kind of by that mid-2000s, the NBA and arcade sports games were kind of dead. EA did bring it back with an NBA Jam on the Wii, but they really were missing for a while.
Basically, to sum this up, this is a great book. If you're a fan of NBA Jam, if you're not, I definitely recommend you reading it. And check out all the other boss fight books. They were the publisher of this and this one was really good. I'm looking forward to reading a few of the others. I can't stress how much fun I had reading this book, and it just brought back a whole bunch of memories, especially from me being a stupid 11-year-old kid and going over to my friends' houses to play NBA Jam to train for the Blockbuster World Championships, which I don't even know why I bothered to train because I was terrible at the game to begin with. It just brought back a whole bunch of memories of playing with my friends, and I had so much fun reading this book. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please let me know in the comments below, and if you absolutely hated something about this, please tell me in the comments. That's really the only way I'm going to get better at this. Anyway, talk to you all later, and have a great day.
Thank you guys very much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, I really do appreciate it. Please like and subscribe if you guys liked what you saw, and if you hated it, please let me know in the comments below.